Thank you for joining us. This is Hypnosis Chat episode 21. Today we're talking about performance anxiety. And we're doing this live, so I'm going to be periodically checking to make sure that Anjali's sitting close enough to me, for example. This is my wife, Anjali. If you've seen any of my previous hypnosis chats, you probably know her very well. And today we're talking about performance anxiety. And as many of you know, my wife, Anjali, is a violin player. She's played in front of cumulatively probably tens of thousands of people from high school on. So she's going to help me to explain and talk about how performance anxiety works. Can you tell us a little tiny bit about your background?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. Well, I have a lot of experience playing violin, I would say. Many moons, many decades playing violin. And basically, I love it. It's my passion. So the one thing that's always been in the way that I've noticed on analyzing, my life over the last years, is in high school, it manifested itself at an early age. So it came to be very early on. In high school, I would be a little bit uneasy, that feeling of uneasiness. There are a couple of main symptoms I've noticed with me. It's, when I was back then, was shaky hands and rapid heartbeat and sweating. And so, when I placed the bow on the string, my hand would shake and then my heart would beat rapidly. Didn't really know what was going on back then. So I tried to mask it, hide it, deal with it. And those are my experiences with performance anxiety. Really fast forward to now, even in 2013, when I first had my first hypnosis session on performance anxiety, I noticed the change instantly. Not only was I able to eliminate the problem, but I was able to control what was holding me back. And that really is what it's all about, just to be the best player you can be, really. And I think hypnosis for me has been a blessing. This has been a blessing for an experience.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good. So when we're talking about performance anxiety, we are talking about, just to kind of define it a little bit, performance is any activity that you're doing that you could do better or worse. And that's it. It's normally it's done in front of people, but you could, if you were, playing solitaire, we could logically talk about your performance as a solitaire player, even if no one's watching. So that's just kind of a side definition. Really, it's about when you have an activity that you could do better or worse, and you probably want to do it better. So the problem is, especially when other people are watching or you're being judged by other people, a lot of people have anxiety. So normally that wouldn't be a problem. The problem is not just that anxiety is uncomfortable or unpleasant or we don't want to have it. That is certainly one issue, but really some people would say a larger issue is whenever you have, so every activity, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which was a big part of my doctoral thesis. And it essentially says that every activity has an optimal level of activation, of physical activation. By that I mean how excited or amped up you are versus how relaxed and calm you are. You don't want to be all the way calm and relaxed, and you don't want to be all the way amped up or pumped. And different activities have different levels of activation that you need in order for optimal performance. So for example, if you were to imagine a scale of maybe 1 to 10, where 1 being very, very relaxed and 10 being completely amped and excited, something like powerlifting would be, you would need a higher level of activation for optimal performance. The more relaxed you were, you would probably not be able to lift as much weight. On the other hand, when you have something that you really have to, finely concentrate on, whether it's maybe like making like little models, like putting little models together with tweezers, so you make like a little horse that's this big, stuff like that requires fine tuning, you might need to be really relaxed for that, maybe like a 3 or something like that. Now, most activities I'd say are optimal around maybe the 4 to 6 range. So maybe for violin, it might be maybe more in the 4 range where you kind of want to be alert but still physically relaxed. Whereas maybe if you're playing baseball, it's more in like the 6 range where you want to be a little bit more physically energetic. So every activity has an optimal level of activation. And of course, it varies among people. In general, powerlifting will require more activation and violin will require less activation for optimal performance. But, and of course, there's going to be a little bit of variation among people also. So for you and for your activity, you're going to have a certain level of activation that's going to be optimal for you having optimal performance. So here's the real problem with anxiety. The problem with anxiety is it increases your level of activation. So wherever you are, even if you, like, let's say you're at home and you're practicing violin or you're practicing solitaire or you're making little models or whatever's going on, if you've done it enough, you probably have a good idea of your level of activation that is optimal for best performance. And you practice for hours at home, tens of hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours in some people's case, and you kind of know where your level is. You unconsciously learn where your level is for optimal performance. And then suddenly you have to perform in front of other people. Depending on how you think about that, it will increase your anxiety to a greater or lesser extent. And the more that increases your anxiety, the more it increases your level of activation, which decreases your performance. Because remember, you've got that kind of optimal level wherever it is. And if your anxiety goes up, that your activation level goes up, and that messes up your performance. So even if you require a very high level, like let's just say that I don't think there's any activities that require like a 10 level of activation, like where maybe powerlifting, I don't know. And then in which case anxiety wouldn't hurt you at all. Like theoretically, if there was an activity that required a 10 level for optimal performance, anxiety probably wouldn't hurt you at all. But that's going to be 1% of activities that we might want to do. So even if something requires like a 9, for example, like sprinting maybe, anxiety is going to, if anxiety pushes you up to a 10, that's going to decrease your performance. Okay, so the summary so far is that anxiety does 2 things. Number 1, it is uncomfortable, and perhaps more importantly, it decreases your performance almost all the time. Okay, so anxiety bad. That's what we've gone over so far. Okay, so all right, so obviously a lot of musicians have anxiety sometimes, right? And you imagine that would decrease their performance. So most of the time, there of course could be like off times when they were too relaxed and the anxiety would push them up to exactly the right state, but that's not usually the case. Right. So generally anxiety decreases performance. So let's see, let's just pause and see if there's any questions right now. So any questions that you can think of that a person might want to ask?
Well, yeah, I have a few questions that I wrote down, just reoccurring questions that I've thought or reoccurring things I've heard other musicians ask me or ask in general. So I've heard that emulating the anxiety experience, maybe running a marathon or a sprint or doing a strenuous activity can create a sense of elevation that you can experience, that you'll feel anxious, you'll sweat, your heartbeat will race. And I've heard that works for some people to, get them in that zone.
Okay. So let's talk about that for a second. I'd find that very interesting. So what's going on here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is people are thinking, so they go through these phases where, okay, I'm practicing at home and I'm finally getting it. I'm able to do it. But then they try to do it in front of other people. They have anxiety. It increases that activation level and decreases their performance. Suddenly they forget or whatever. So then there are some people, and I know there's specific people who have said this. We don't have to say any names or anything, like any famous names or anything, but there were some people that said this. And so what they're saying is, I'm going to go run a marathon first. So I come back and I've already got that increased activation state, and then I'm going to practice that way. So they're essentially trying to practice with the anxiety state, which is the opposite of what I think that you should do. Okay? That is just like, let's say I said, whenever I, turn my stove up to high and put a bunch of paper on it and leave the house, I come back and my house is on fire. So what I decided to do was go over to my friend's house, light their house on fire, and kind of hang out there a little bit so I can get used to being in a house with fire. That way, when I come back to my house and it's on fire, it won't bother me as much.
Trickery.
Okay, that's what that is. Okay, so you don't want to continue. See, and the real issue is they don't realize they're creating the problem themselves. And they definitely don't realize they can stop creating the problem themselves. That's what this is going to be about. So what you don't want to, anytime you hear a solution like, oh, well, I have this problem, so I'm going to duplicate the problem elsewhere so that I get used to it, and then it won't bother me as much. That's not going to be the right solution. So instead of creating another state where you're artificially creating the anxiety, it's much better to not create the anxiety in the first place. And of course, that makes sense, but the person didn't think that because they don't even realize they're creating the problem, let alone that they have the ability to stop creating the problem. Okay, so let's talk about that for a few minutes. So far we've talked about anxiety bad because it doesn't feel good and it decreases your performance. We've talked about how every activity has an optimal level of activation, and anxiety increases your level of activation, so it pushes it off of optimal. Basically, that's a way of saying anxiety almost always decreases performance. We've talked about the idea that we've hinted at the idea that you create this problem yourself mentally, and you have the ability to stop creating it. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail now. Okay, so think about a performance activity that you do. Whatever it is. If you don't do anything competitively, maybe you do something creatively. Maybe you there's something in your life that you either are glad that you're good at or you would like to get good at, even if it's just making the perfect egg or whatever. So think about an activity that you do that you could do better or worse. So in other words, a performance activity. Okay, so there are essentially three ways that you can think about it. When you think about performance activities, and there's three ways you can think about it, and two of them create anxiety, and one of them creates confidence. So first, we're going to talk about the two that create anxiety. And many people, if not everyone, will recognize these ways of thinking and immediately notice how those things create anxiety. So, and especially if you have an activity, try to think about an activity that creates anxiety. Probably everyone has something that creates anxiety, something they feel comfortable with. It'll probably help you understand this better if you pick one that creates anxiety or maybe did create anxiety in the past. All right, so way number one, you can think about other people watching you and judging you. So if you imagine doing this activity, okay, so let's say I said to Anjali, I'm going to use Anjali as an example, if that's okay. So if I say, imagine, okay, so you have a concert. You're playing violin at a concert. And so you sit down, you're ready to play, and then suddenly all you can think about is the image of everyone looking at you. And it's quiet, and they're all looking at you, waiting for you.
Common.
Okay, they're looking at you, and they're waiting for you, and they're like, well, what's she going to do? What are you going to do? Okay, that's going to create anxiety in anybody. That's going to create anxiety in anybody, not because there's something wrong with you, but because that your brain works perfectly. You thought in an anxiety-producing style, and your brain, being a perfectly working brain, produced anxiety. Okay? I cannot overemphasize that. There's nothing in here that's wrong with you. Unless you have physical brain damage, there's nothing wrong with you. Whatever the effects you have that are not useful, that you don't like, it's just your brain working perfectly. You're just giving it the wrong instruction. If you imagine an activity in such a way that it produces anxiety, your brain says, oh, you want anxiety? Okay, no problem, I can do that. And it gives you anxiety because it works perfectly. All right, so I want that to be super clear. The problem is not up here as far as your brain is concerned. The problem is the instructions that you give to your brain. Okay, so it's the first way. The first way that you could think about a performance activity is the other people. Anything related to the other people. Number two, you could think about yourself. Okay, so imagine I said, Anjali, you've got a concert, you sit down, and then this time, what you think of is, oh, well, what do I look like? Am I holding the violin right? How does my hair look? Am I sitting the right way? And notice how you can think about that and start getting anxious about it. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because your brain works perfectly. You are telling your brain to create anxiety, and your brain, being a perfectly working brain, is creating anxiety for you as instructed. Okay, so anytime you think about any performance activity and you think about the other people or you think about yourself, then your brain is triggered to create anxiety. So what's the third way? The third way is the way that you think about every activity that you already feel comfortable with. Take a moment to think about an activity that you already feel comfortable with. Maybe it's bowling, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's fixing something, maybe it's creating something, maybe it's just watching your favorite TV show. Think about something you feel comfortable doing. Imagine if this is comfortable for most people. Imagine if your friend asked you to describe your favorite movie. Most people are comfortable doing that. So what would you do? Your friend asks you about your favorite movie. Well, what's it about? What do you think of? Do you think of your friend staring at you, waiting for you to tell them the movie? Probably not. Do you think about what you look like describing the movie? Probably not. You probably think about the movie. You probably think about what happened in the movie. What's the plot? What are the characters? What happened? Why did you like it? Notice how when you do that, you are telling your brain to just do its job normally, to describe the movie, talk about the movie, and your brain feels good about that. You didn't tell your brain to feel bad in any way, and so it's just going to kind of do its job and tell the person about the movie. Likewise, let's say I said to Anjali, imagine, okay, you're about to do a concert. You sit down, and then the concert starts, and you're playing violin perfectly. You're doing it just like you practiced. You're following the pages. The violin sounds great. You're going on, and we fast forward to the end. It was fine. You did a great job. You enjoyed it. It was, you feel elated. You're done. You were successful. Well, you feel good about that. That's something you're just programming your brain to feel good about the activity. So you have to, in order to make any change, you have to do three things. Number one, you have to understand why the problem is there, and you have to understand a better way to do that activity, in this case, a thinking activity. So to continue with the violin example, number one, you have to if you imagine when you play a concert, if you have anxiety when you think about playing a concert, for example, number one, you have to understand that you are creating those images yourself. You have to understand the three ways to think about any activity. You have to understand that two of them create anxiety and one of them doesn't. So basically the first step is the understanding step. What am I doing wrong? What can I do better? And this is all thinking. This is not about the actual technique. This is thinking. So that's number one. Number two, you have to make the decision that you're going to think about it in the new way from now on. And number three, you have to monitor your brain to make sure it does it the new way for a little while. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes it's a few days, sometimes it's a week. It's usually not a long time. You basically just have to babysit your brain in the new way of thinking for a little while until it gets used to it. That's how brains think. Brains are basically biological computers. They're a lot like computers, but they're biological in the sense that they learn things slowly, in the sense that they don't learn them instantly like a digital computer. They learn them over the course of hours or days, because they get used to ideas. Getting used to ideas is almost a better way of thinking about something than learning it. So the three things you have to do are, number one, understand you're creating the anxiety. How am I creating the anxiety? Maybe I'm thinking about the people when I think about concerts. Maybe I'm thinking about myself. Instead, I'm going to think about the music, my technique, the steps, the strategy. Okay? And then you have to decide that you're going to do that from now on. Sounds like kind of is that step really important? Yes, there's people all the time that know what to do, but they never decide to do it. And then guess what? They don't do it. And then you have to monitor to make sure your brain continues to become used to it until it is second nature, which again doesn't usually take very long and is well worth the minimal effort required. Okay, so any other we're going to do like a little mini session. It's not going to be a full hypnosis session, but it's going to be a mini session. Just to, you can kind of think of it as like a mental exercise to help organize the information into your brain in a very kind of relaxing and efficient way. Before we do that, do you have any questions about anything?
I have a few questions.
Sure,
actually.
please.
I don't know if anybody else has a question. I'm not sure where that is, but suppose you're in that zone. You've trained yourself to do all that stuff, and you also have to worry about your orchestra members, your band members. And what if someone goes, "Oh my gosh, there's so many people in the audience. Like, look at the audience. Look how many people there are. Oh my goodness." Like, suppose you have an outside force interjecting.
Okay. So let's just say you're at a heavy metal concert. I know that's exactly the kind of place you would go to. And you see someone, you're there with a friend, you see someone a little ways away in the arena lighting themselves on fire. Okay? And your friend says, "Hey, that person's lighting themselves on fire." You would probably say, "That's not a good idea. You shouldn't do that. Don't light yourself on fire." Okay? So if you see someone else, or let's just say, here a better example. Let's say your friend says, "Oh, I see someone lighting themselves on fire. I'm thinking about lighting myself on fire too. Wouldn't that be cool?" You would say, "Jeremy, that's not a good idea. You should not light yourself on fire. You just focus on the concert and enjoy the music, and you don't have to worry about lighting yourself on fire. It's a bad idea." Okay?
Makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that's really what it is. See, it's funny because that was a very common sense kind of question, but to me, it's complete nonsense. Okay? So if someone else says to you, "Oh, what about all those people?" You would naturally want to say, "Well, no, we're not, the people are not." Here, let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples. So the original story of the marathon, I'm going to give you the short version of this because I'm going to talk about it in more detail in another video. No one knows really how the marathon started. There's lots of stories, but the stories kind of revolve around the idea of there was, Athens, or one of the cities. No one knows exactly what city. And they were surprise attacked. And they needed these horses, but they weren't going to be there in time because the city that had the horses did not know they were being attacked. So we didn't have telephone or internet. So one person ran from Athens in sandals, 26 miles, ran to deliver the message they needed the horses immediately, and died on the spot. The horses were delivered, and they turned the tide of the battle. So obviously his efforts were greatly rewarded. Now, when he showed up, do you think he cared what he looked like? Do you think he cared how many people were looking at him? Absolutely not. The most important thing he was doing was delivering the message. He was delivering this message, and that was more important than him, and it was more important than the people. When you are playing music, or whatever you're doing, when you're playing music, when you're fixing a car, when you're making breakfast for your wife, whatever you're doing, what's important is the message that you're delivering to the world, the value that you're giving to the world. Don't worry about yourself. Don't worry about the other people, except for your wife. Not talking about that. But when you're playing music, the people are not important. You're not important. What's really important is the music. When you're playing music, I want you to think the music is the most important thing. Not worried about the other people. I'm not worried about myself. That's a better way of saying it. Not worried about anything else other than delivering this message that will be here forever. This music is immortal. I'm not immortal. The audience is not immortal. All we're doing is I am the vessel for this immortal art form for this particular period of time. Okay? And that will allow you to understand how your message, this thing that you're doing or giving to the world, is the most important thing going on right then.
Yes.
Okay? Mm-hmm. So does that help understand that? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do you have any other questions before we?
Just how about the question
Sure.
of just artificially putting something in your body, like, oh, I eat a banana before I go on stage, or I take beta blockers, or those things where people try and fast resolve.
Yeah. In all seriousness, those things might be good or bad, but in the end, if you're still creating the problem yourself, you're still going to have the problem. And if you stop creating the problem, you're not going to have the problem. So whether or not you eat a banana is going to be much less important than whether you continue creating a problem or not. All right, thank you very much for joining us. This has been Hypnosis Chat, episode 21. We are going to be streaming every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the near foreseeable future for everyone who is stuck indoors because of coronavirus. We're just going to try to give a little bit of extra value to people that can't make it out of their houses right now. So feel free to have questions, or if you have a topic that you want to have discussed, feel free to leave a comment or send an email, and we will look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.